Launching a podcast can be intimidating, especially if you're not used to recording audio and video content. But that doesn't mean you can't start to build a foundation first.
Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, I'm Tristan. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. The show is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. Now, I work with a lot of companies who are launching a podcast for the first time, and it can be overwhelming. You have to get the theme of the show figured out. You have to understand who your host will be, identify guests, develop topics to pursue. You have to determine the format and structure of each episode. And there's all the technical requirements involved. But your company's podcast doesn't have to start as a podcast. Recently, I had a prep call with an upcoming guest on Recorded Content. One of the things I uncovered was how the company's podcast got started. The company didn't buy a course. The company didn't buy fancy microphones. The company didn't spend 6 months on a strategy document. Instead, the marketing team scheduled interviews with internal experts and specific partners. This approach allowed the marketing team to build podcasting skills without actually launching a podcast. The team got to practice with research, developing an objective for a conversation, planning and scheduling interviews, crafting interview questions, conducting interviews. With this approach, it was a low-risk activity. Even though the conversations weren't published as podcast episodes, the team used these interviews as a foundation for blog posts, ads, web copy, and more. It was viewed as practice, but the added benefit of learning from one another. In many ways, podcasts are published conversations. And when you focus on the art of conversation first, it helps when your team is ready to launch the podcast. Recently, I had a conversation with Brett McGrath on the Modern Day Marketer podcast. Brett and I talked about how organizations can crawl and walk before they run with a podcast. But before you even crawl, I believe your organization needs to have a different mindset about what a podcast can actually be.
Yeah, the big thing, Brett, that we like to stress, at least from my perspective, is that a podcast is more than an audio channel. And I think what a lot of marketers wrestle with is, like you said, ABM is this checkbox or another layer to what we're doing. But we like to flip the script there and say, a podcast is really a forum to have conversations with people in your space. They could be solo episodes where you're sharing your own perspective in a creative way. But a lot of times where we start with companies is building on interviews or conversations that they're having internally. For example, maybe a marketer is interviewing her CEO and they're having these conversations and they want a way to capture that information. That's one way. A lot of organizations start with a blog series where they're doing interviews with subject matter experts, and they're trying to create a richer experience with the text that they create and pull and curate different perspectives versus just, voicing what their perspective is and not having like a full story. So they want to round it out a little better. And so when we change that mindset and you believe that a podcast can be more than an audio channel, then you can actually build your content strategy around the conversations that you're having. And that's really the shift that we're trying to make when we have the conversations with people that might be early on in their process or even when they're getting ready to launch. It's like, think about your podcast in a different way, not as just this audio file that gets uploaded to Buzzsprout and then on Spotify, Apple, etc. So if you start to envision how a podcast is more than an audio channel, then it means you can actually get started without a microphone or recording an episode at all. During my conversation with Brett, I broke down a few ways customers have approached us at various stages. So Brett, I'll go through a couple of examples of where podcasts have started before they've come to us as a customer. And these are all like real examples that I'll walk through. One is just a blog series with interviews. So And when I say a podcast doesn't have to start as a podcast, there are a lot of skills that you can develop, and a lot of the mechanics of a podcast can be in place before you actually hit record. So if you have, let's say, an interview series that you want to highlight on your blog, you can do those interviews over Zoom or just over a phone call, and that can feed a lot of the material that you include in those blog posts. So you're exercising that interview muscle, so to speak, and you're developing episode topics, and you're trying to tackle conflicts that your audience has. And we've had customers come to us where they're like, hey, I'm doing all these interviews already. I'm scheduling the interviews. I'm having an hour-long conversation, and I'm developing written content out of that, but I don't have the video. I don't have the audio content. And I feel like I'm missing out there. And now it's time that I want to turn on that aspect of the interview process. And that's worked out really well because this particular marketing team, they had a lot of good material on their site. Their blog was really rich with information, but now they're looking to add layers to it. And so that's really a good place to start, even with management as well, because it's like, hey, we're already doing some of these things. Now we want to turn it up a notch, and this will help us, with paid campaigns. It'll help us build more material in the blog posts we're writing now. It'll help us share more stuff organically on social. It'll really give us a lot more information on the marketing side. So that's one example. Another is internal interviews with senior executives or subject matter experts that you have internally. And one thing that I see as a challenge with a lot of marketing teams is they're kind of over here in their silo, and they're doing the marketing stuff, and they're launching campaigns, updating the website, but the cross organization communication doesn't exist, and they're a little out of touch with customers. They're also not communicating well with sales. So, or even customer success, like what's working right now for your customers, and how are they using your particular technology or service? And if you can do an interview series internally to gather that information to make your marketing better, that's a great place to start with a podcast. You can, once again, use that interview structure to get information to feed a lot of the material that you're doing. And that's really just a good jumping off point, where it's similar in nature to that blog interview series, but it's just more internal facing. You're not publishing these things, but you're using this information internally. So that's another good example where we've seen a customer come to us like, hey, we're doing all these interviews and these weekly meetings with, the CEO. We're getting a brain dump of like, what are the trends that he's thinking about now? Or, what is on her mind right now with customers? Like, what's the product roadmap look like? And all those conversations get, kind of shared in that weekly meeting, but it's like, how can we now repurpose this into a podcast format? So that's worked really well. Another one that I had here on my list is starting an internal or even private podcast. So let's say you're not quite comfortable. You want this thing to be shared with the world yet, but you want to practice and you want to create a private podcast that only employees can listen to. And this occurred where we had a national organization. They had a sales team that was dispersed all around the country. So you had a lot of the classic like regional sales reps, right? And there's all this information that these folks can share and become valuable in other deals, right? Like if I'm a regional rep in the Southeast, my experiences with my customers can be very valuable for someone on the West Coast. But guess what? Unless you have some forum to share this information, it's not really going to help your entire team. So there was an organization that created an internal private podcast where it was just an interview series, very informal, and it wasn't even the same host all the time. A lot of times just two people sharing different experiences with the sales cycle. They might be in the sales cycle, or they may have just closed a deal, what have you. And these conversations were released in the form of a podcast. And that was just really a great way to prove out the concept for management and say, hey, this is working for us. Imagine if we now thought about how we could communicate this to customers, on the marketing side of things. And so that really worked well because it wasn't like a foreign concept for this team. They were already building out some of this material already. And then the last one I have is a live event or a virtual event series that your company might be doing already. So we see a lot of customers come to us where they're like, we've done this webinar series. It works pretty well. But people are asking us different questions, or they want to see information in a different way, or they really want to drill into what Mary said on this webinar. And we don't really have a way to do that. And so we've worked with folks to kind of reshape the mindset that they have with either a webinar series or like a live event that they're doing on Zoom or something like that. It's like, okay, how can we maybe take what you're doing and reformat that into a podcast? Or how can we understand what's working and then build a podcast concept off of that? So that's worked really well too. And the nice thing about events is it's not something that has to be every week. I mean, you could even use this with a lot of the live events that you go to or trade shows. You can create like this forum, this podcast mechanism to have these conversations. And then there's a way to share it with the external world, after you get back from that event. So these are some examples that I think have worked really well as a jumping off point.
Launching a podcast can be intimidating, especially if you're not used to recording audio and video content. But that doesn't mean you can't start to build a foundation first. Hopefully, the scenarios I went through in this episode will give you a few ideas on how to get the process started at your company. So that's all I have for you today, and I hope to see you next week on Recorded Content.
Thanks for listening to Recorded Content, a show brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcasting agency for B2B tech marketers. We do the podcast stuff so you can focus on strategy, building brand awareness, and developing new relationships. To learn more about how you can launch and grow a podcast for your company, check out motionagency.io. Thanks for listening to Recorded Content.